From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up here, K-State's Gregg Hanzlicek will go over several health management considerations for beef calves that will be weaned early this summer because of drought-stressed pasture conditions. Also, we'll have excerpts from this week's podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. Brad White and Bob Larson will talk about supplementing trace minerals to the cow herd on grass, and they'll share their latest thinking on managing against BVD in stocker calves. Today's Kansas Wheat Harvest Update features Extension Agricultural Agent Shad Marston of McPherson County. And on this week's Horticulture segment, K-State's Megan Kennelly will talk about what's causing warm season lawn grass to struggle so far this summer. All that ahead on this Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome to our Thursday edition of Agriculture Today. Glad to have you along. Well, during our first half hour today, we'll concentrate on various topics in the area of bovine health management, starting with the health of early weaned beef calves. Gregg Hanzlicek is over from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State, where he's the director of the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit. So, Greg, early weaning those spring-born calves, that is appealing to quite a few producers out there who are contending with thinner-than-normal pasture resources right now.
That's exactly right. Driving around Kansas as we do often, it's spotty, but there's a lot of pastures that are starting to struggle, and it looks like we may have some issues with the amount of forage that's available for these cows and these calves that are on pasture.
And underscoring that because here we are in late June, and we're talking about these conditions, which normally we start to worry about in later July or August.
That's exactly right. We talk about forage quality and forage availability when we get into August and September, and that's when we start talking about supplementing, but we're really early in the year. And we may want to start supplementing, but there is a way, which is early weaning, to get around that supplementing these cows this early.
If one's going to early wean, this is the theme today, one needs to think about a whole host of things first, right? And we'll list those, of course, but that needs to be the mindset.
That's exactly right. It is a good tool, and there's a lot of reasons to do it, but there's things like facilities, labor, and like you said, we'll get into them that need to be, even the price of the calf that needs to be discussed before one says, hey, let's early wean to save our cows and save our pastures.
And on that very point, what early weaning does for the cow, how it will relieve pressure, you might outline that.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and that's the main reason that we're doing it. And when we talk about, at least in this conversation, about early weaning, instead of weaning at 6 to 7 months, we're talking 3 to 5 months. I mean, you can wean earlier if you have to, but we're talking a month or two earlier. And what that does, it stops the milk production in the cow, and therefore she's going to consume less feed because she's not producing milk. And then also, especially in young cows and heifers, is that there's more nutrients available to maintain their body plus add body condition, which we know body condition going into next calving is really, really important. So that's the main reason that we want to do this.
And all of this has been quantified through research over the years, right?
There's a lot of really good research that looked at the difference between pairs in pasture and dry cows that aren't lactating, and as far as the amount of forage that they actually eat. I just remember one study where it showed that 290-pound calves on average are going to consume about 5 pounds of dry matter in grass a day, which if we look at just total pounds of grass, that's going to be 8 to 9 pounds. So you multiply that times every calf in the pasture, that's a lot less grass that's available to maintain that cow.
And therefore, in combination with that, the cow herself will be consuming less forage if you remove that calf. So that really doubles down, if you will, doesn't it?
That's exactly right. And then if we're talking about maybe not the quality of the grass being so poor, but the amount not being there, then the cow, she's not going to produce what she normally would anyway. And if we've got the calf on the cow, that calf is not going to perform up to its genetic potential because that milk's not there that's normally in the diet.
Yeah. So those are all good reasons to think about early weaning, but that means that you're going to be managing that calf in a fashion other than leaving him or her on the cow, obviously. So now you're talking about dry lotting that calf in most circumstances, right?
That's correct. In most circumstances, even though the price of an early weaned calf, because they're lighter weight, the price per pound is going to be higher, the total amount that the producer's going to receive for that calf is less, and so for most producers, economically, it doesn't make sense to sell the early weaned calves right off the cows. So that does mean that these calves probably should be dry lotted for a period of time to get them on feed, to gain some weight, and get them up to market weight.
A number of feedstuffs might work. Something that doesn't work, you say, fermented feeds.
And that's kind of the recommendation, is at least early on after this weaning that we stay away from fermented feeds, corn silage, sorghum silage, even haylage, or anything that's put into a silo, bunker, or anything probably should be left out of the diet at least early on after weaning.
Other than that, concentrates or dry roughage, all of that will work to some extent.
Absolutely. And it's got to be in the right combination of dry roughage versus the dry grains, and that's where the nutritionist with a balanced ration make sure we have the proper trace minerals in that because we want to maintain that immune system in these baby calves is really, really important.
But it's beyond diet. There are other management things to think about here. Grouping those calves by size, by age, that has value, you think, Greg?
It does have value, and there's a lot of good research to show that calves of the same size, which we say the same age, they'll compete better with each other. And there's good research to show, although it's not always practical, that if we can keep those calf pens to 20 calves or less, those calves they wean better as early wean calves. Again, that's not always practical, but that's something to consider.
How they learn to eat concentrate, how they learn what water is all about, all of that is vital to success here.
Exactly. It's not just the diet. It's the can they eat out of the bunk? Right. Is the bunk made for bigger calves, and those calves can't reach the bottom of the bunk? Can they not drink out of the waters? Do they know where the bunks and the waters are? There's a really cool research project that was done down in Oklahoma State that showed if you'd put one or more older animals in with these groups of early weaned calves, those older animals will show them where the water is, where the bunk is, and it seems to work for a better transition.
Basically a mentor animal.
Exactly, yeah.
So that's something to keep in mind, but you've got to keep on top of all of these things to make sure that transition goes as smoothly as possible.
Exactly, and like I said earlier, it's not just the diet, but it's all those other management things. It's if they're dry lotted, it's important that we try to keep the dust down because then we can have some eye problems, we can have some respiratory problems. So it's a combination of diet and facilities is what it is.
Greg, right to directly the health side of it, early weaned calves, there are a couple of specific health conditions that you're worried about.
Exactly, and it's just like weaned calves regardless of the age, but bovine respiratory disease is going to be number one, so we want to try to do as much as we can to prevent that, which means reduce stress. So if we're talking early weaning, we'd really like that castration, that dehorning to be done several weeks before we're planning on early weaning. We probably want to use a vaccine, a respiratory vaccine. The downside is that these calves are young enough that they might be carrying maternal antibodies from the colostrum, which at least in some cases may interfere with the effectiveness of the vaccine. Producers use their veterinarian for guidance, but this is one of those cases where an intranasal vaccine will actually work in the face of maternal antibodies, so that's something to think about for sure.
BRD, coccidiosis, those are where you really need to put your focus on.
Coccidiosis, we've seen some major wrecks, not just in early wean, but normal wean calves that were in a dry lot situation, and then there was standing water. Coccidia is passed through the feces and then calves consume either the feces or the water that's contaminated, you can see some major breaks. So dry lot situation, the producer try to do their best to keep corners of the pens from accumulating water so that those calves aren't drinking in there.
And one is to stay on top of this more than just a few days. This is going to take some rather intense monitoring, isn't it, to make sure that these conditions are appropriate for calf health?
Absolutely. We strongly recommend that these calves are observed at least twice a day after weaning, and that a lot of times as producers or veterinarians will look for calves that don't come up to the bunk when we're feeding. And that's a good thing to look at, because if they're not coming up, there's probably an issue. But bovines are really good at hiding disease. And so some of those calves, even though they're sick, will come up to the bunk, but they'll just stand there at the bunk. So it's important that the producers not only look at the back of the calves at the bunk, but go to the front and see who's eating and who's not, because those that aren't may need to be pulled and looked at further.
One particular we didn't mention, deworming those calves is vital as well.
Absolutely. Forgot all about that, but that is crucial because the calves picked up the worms in the pasture. There's no doubt about it. This age of calf is where the worms are going to do their biggest damage, not only on feed efficiency, rate of gain, but we do know those internal parasites have a negative impact on immunity. So that's another reason to get rid of those worms, and so we have a really good immune system going into this weaning process.
There's a lot going on here, but folks have succeeded in the past with early weaning and continue to do so, but not without paying specific attention to each of these very matters, Gregg.
Absolutely. It's like so many things, and cow-calf producers know this. There's so many things being a producer. It's usually not just one thing. It's a whole group of things that have to be done correctly. Maybe even the stars have to be aligned correctly in order for there to be a positive outcome.
Once more, do whatever you need to do to line this program up correctly, and if you need to bring in consultants either on the health side, the nutrition side, or both, by all means use that expertise to the fullest, as early weaning beef calves is a management commitment that's not to be taken lightly. Gregg, good input as always. Thank you for coming over.
Thank you.
Gregg Hanzlicek with us from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State. Some thoughts on succeeding with early weaning of beef calves in the mid-part of summer here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today continues now with highlights from the latest podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute here at Kansas State University. Contributing this time around, K-State veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson. Here's Brad to get it going.
We had a question from one of our listeners, and the question was really about trace mineral management. Specifically, there was a question about copper, how to figure out how to control that. What are your thoughts? What are some of the best things we can do, and how important are those trace minerals?
Well, it was a very good question from one of our listeners, and the challenge is the answer isn't particularly easy, because I don't want to give just a blanket answer for trace minerals, because trace minerals, the amount of mineral in the plant has a lot to do with the soil that the plant is grown on and the types of plants as well. So there's some very important geographic differences. So what is true for one ranching operation could be quite different, even relatively close. And so I really hate to give blanket recommendations. Honestly, most soils, most situations, there are not severe trace mineral problems. But occasionally you'll run into some areas where there are. And so sometimes trace minerals are a pretty easy part of the nutrition package because there's really no real problems. But other times it can be a problem. We had an interesting case when I was in graduate school, and we did a little bit of copper work where there were some areas in Kansas where the soil, it was kind of an alkaline soil, a lot of shale, and there were some really high molybdenum levels, low copper levels, and we did see some problems that we had to address with some kind of enhanced mineral supplements, not just your typical trace mineral pack that you would typically find at the feed mill.
Because the trace minerals, we're talking about copper, selenium, molybdenum, anything. Those are
zinc would be another one.
So those we know are important, and if we do, there have been studies, especially you look on the cow-calf side, reproduction is one of the big things. And if there's a lack of those trace minerals, what does it do to reproduction?
Yeah, so trace minerals can affect reproductive efficiency. So, and that looks at hormone levels, embryo and oocyte or egg health. So it can affect a lot of different things in the reproductive system, and on the male side as well. Also, you can see some with copper, some joint problems and some skin problems associated with that too. So they can cause broad problems across the animal. And again, a lot of it has to deal with, a lot of times it's not just one trace mineral. We have antagonisms between different trace minerals, or you can have two trace minerals that are both low that need to be addressed. And again, that's kind of why I hate to give just blanket recommendations, but you if you really do suspect a trace mineral problem, you should kind of work up the case. And so
more is always better?
No, more is not always better. Again, because if you think about all the different minerals, they do interact with each other. And the positive is sometimes one trace mineral will kind of spare another one, meaning that it can kind of cover for it if it's a little bit low. Other times it'll tie it up and make it less available. And so work with your veterinarian, nutritionist, anyone else with some expertise.
A lot of times the local extension people will have an idea of what's the soil content in the area, what do we expect there.
Yeah,
right?
because that local knowledge gives you a good starting place, that in this area we know we're a little low on selenium or copper or something. So that's a good place to start. But then a lot of times you'll do some animal sampling, such as blood samples and some liver biopsies.
Yep.
You'll do some feed sampling to get a handle on the different mineral profile in the forages that you're consuming. And then you really kind of have to, again, don't come up with the same solution that you heard from a neighbor. You really do need to work it up seriously because you need a specific answer for your operation.
Kind of the Goldilocks principle of we don't want too much, we don't want too little, we want it just right. And so you have to figure that out for your farm.
Yeah. And back to what I said before, there's a lot of forages, a lot of ranching operations where trace minerals are not a big problem. That what is available in the plants is pretty close to what the cows need. But there are also some of those operations that would benefit from kind of an enhanced workup and a better trace mineral program for their ranch.
The other topic, and since it's you and I, since Pendel and Weber are not here, we can talk about health stuff.
We get to do veterinary stuff.
Let's talk about bovine viral diarrhea, or BVD, because we see it every year, and we see cases. I had some calls this spring. I know you did as well, talking about how to handle this. First, it's a virus. Tell me a little bit about it.
Yes. So BVD, bovine viral diarrhea, is a disease that is fairly contagious, and it has several interesting components, I guess. One is that, we talk about diseases that mostly affect young suckling calves or diseases that mostly affect adult cows. Well, this is a virus that actually can cause disease throughout the beef production chain. Young calves, it can lead to scours and other problems in young calves. It can lead to abortion in adult cows. It can lead to respiratory disease in our weaned calves and our feedlot cattle. It causes problems in dairies. So basically all cattle, all ages from very young to old.
So it affects all classes, but let's hone this discussion in on the cow-calf side. So from what you're saying, I would expect if I went to a farm or a ranch and they had BVD, we'd see lots of problems and it'd be obvious that they had BVD.
Well, it can look that way in that if a herd is pretty naive, meaning it doesn't really have any immune protection to BVD, and they're then exposed, it can come in and cause several abortions, some sick calves, some dead calves, and you'll have losses, again, in different age categories. But
so it'd be obvious that there's a problem.
It'd be obvious. The interesting thing is that same herd in a couple of years, even if I did nothing, would have some stability. You'd still have some losses, but it wouldn't be as high. And it's because, the virus is circulating in the herd. The herd gets some immunity, and you don't have as severe effects. Now, the effects usually show up in those animals that are less immune mature, such as your replacement heifers or any new animals you brought onto the operation or very young calves. it's not as bad in following years than it is the first year that it comes into an operation. But it maintains itself at kind of this low level of losses that is still high enough that it's causing biologic and economic loss. So you're losing a few abortions that you shouldn't have. You're losing a few dead calves that you shouldn't have. It's not just...
So if they die, where does it stay in the herd? How does it keep in the herd?
So that's another interesting thing about the BVD virus that makes it a little bit different than others. It has a persistently infected... So some animals are persistently infected. So most animals, if they're exposed to BVD, they get the virus in their body. Takes a few days to reach, to multiply and to be at high levels. They'll be sick for a few days, and they'll be shedding the virus to other cattle for a few days, and then they recover.
That'd be a transient infection.
Yeah, a temporary infection, similar to a human cold.
Yep.
Right? Very similar to that. And that's part of the disease spread. But then there are these permanently infected or persistently infected calves. And the interesting thing about them is they became permanently infected during the pregnancy. When they were in their mother, they got exposed to the virus. They have it in their body, and their own body never develops an immune response to it. So those calves are born, and they shed that virus basically for their whole life. So that's that permanent or persistent infection.
So that, and I'm going to call them PI, because a lot of people call those PIs.
Right.
Those PIs are only formed during so they can be formed anytime during gestation, or when do they get formed?
Kind of in that first to middle third of pregnancy is when we see them being formed, and that is the only time. So if a calf is born and he's not a PI, he can never become a PI. He's either born a PI or he's not born a PI.
So this exposure, day 40 to 120 of gestation, which is now for a lot of guys. So if we started breeding, we're right in that window. If they're exposed to BVD at this point, you have a chance of creating PIs.
That is correct.
And that's how it stays in the cow-calf herd. So this is a pretty critical time for our pregnant cows, that day 40 to 120 of gestation, to make sure they avoid BVD exposure either through other PIs in the herd. We could test and get rid of those calves. Or what about stocker calves, things like that? Fence line exposure, could we bring BVD in that way?
Yes, some of the interesting cases that I get called in on, because I'm at the university, so I get to see some of the worst cases. A group of pregnant cows are in fence line contact with a large group of stocker calves that are brought in. And then, there might be several hundred of those stocker calves, but one or two of them could be persistently infected. So we've seen some pretty severe cases in a cow-calf herd where the exposure was really across the fence with a group of stocker calves. The other thing is I brought on a pregnant pair or pregnant heifer, and the calf in the heifer was actually the one that was a persistently infected animal. And so once it's born, then that exposes
So if I bought a pregnant heifer and she had a PI in utero when she came onto the farm, I wouldn't know, and there's no way to test for that.
No, there's no way to know that, and I wouldn't know that until that calf is on the ground and possibly causing problems.
But you could test them at birth?
Yes. We have a number of really good tests for this PI calf. And a lot of times people will use an ear notch, and that's just, little notching pliers, grab a little bit of a skin sample from the ear. There's several different tests that different labs offer. All are pretty accurate. And so we have some good tests to identify those persistently infected calves to remove them from the herd.
And we'll come back. Let's revisit that topic a little bit more and talk about prevention.
Yeah, we've got some good tools to keep this disease under control.
And we'll talk a little bit more about it next week and maybe talk about vaccines and some of the testing. Thanks for joining us on BCI Cattle Chat. We will talk to you again next week.
K-State veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson there. You can hear the entire podcast at beefcattleinstitute.org, beefcattleinstitute.org. This is Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
We're back now on Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And now, the update on the Kansas wheat harvest, this time centering on harvest activity in McPherson County, in the central part of the state. Extension agricultural agent there, Shad Marston, is along with us. Shad, what was the general thought on the quality of this harvest as you were going into cutting in McPherson County?
Well, I think a little bit better than average for our bushels per acre. Most of the farmers were right around that 40 range, maybe a little bit under 40. We did have some 50 and maybe some spots in some fields that were 60. And then we also had some that was down as 20 and in the teens. And so when you average a little better than what you might predict with all the problems that we had in our county with the late freeze, April, the first weekend, Saturday in April, it got really cold, and then the next Saturday in April, it got awful cold. And so, our wheat was immature, and I think that helped quite a bit because that frost that we had late really didn't affect as much as some people might have thought.
Again, this is one of those years that shows how resilient wheat is in the face of adversity, though, isn't it?
It really came back really quick, and when we thought our harvest was going to be a week or even 2 weeks later, we found that we got into the field and started harvesting actually maybe a little bit ahead of our average time of June 15th. So we were in the field around the 10th, and they were cutting strong the 12th and 13th of June. I think everything went fairly smooth. We did have a few light showers during that harvest week, but everything was pretty smooth, and we didn't have any problem with our moisture on our grain this year. When I talked to some of the people at the elevators, they were really surprised about how full the kernels looked. Not a lot of broken and shriveled kernels there. At the beginning it was, and I think some of the farmers turned up their fans on their combines and blew some of them smaller pieces out, and so they really had some nice test weights, and I think that probably averaged around 60 in our county this year for the test weight.
That's a strong number as well. Are you pushing toward completion of harvest then? It sounds like you're getting close.
We are done. There is maybe just a little bit of some farmers that had maybe a problem with the combine or two that haven't got theirs cut. We've had rain here in the last couple of days, but our harvest was pretty much over. The highlight of harvest here in McPherson was our protein was extremely high. I cut a test plot at the Golly test plot in Mound Ridge, and our lowest protein was 15.6, and our highest was 17.
Wow.
So all of that, it averaged in the 16s on our protein, and that was with 25 different varieties. But again, we had no problem with moisture. Our test weight was not as good there, ranged from 56 to 61, but our protein was extremely high there.
Those are remarkable protein numbers, almost unheard of, Shad.
Yes, and it really was. This last test plot, I ran the numbers yesterday from our Inman test plot, and they were more reasonable, I think, what most people got in the 12s, 11 and 12s for a protein, which is still really high. We were thinking last year at this time that 8 and 9 was getting most of our protein in our county, and now this year we have jumped up considerably. But we don't have the yields that we've had the last year either.
Well, you've brought in your test plots, or most of them to this point. Are you getting any vibes on variety performance and specific varieties that have stood out this year?
It's really, we're just getting the numbers in. I still have one more to get in. Monument was really good in one. It excelled 67 bushels the acre on our Inman plot. On the other one, Mint was the high, and it was only 36. But we just saw just a lot of variation. We were so wet there in the fall, if we can say that, because that's hard to imagine, right when we tried to plant wheat, and then it turned off and was so dry for a long period of time that, we knew we were going to be down, but, it was really a good harvest for us.
Yeah. Good report to hear. Shad, thanks for the word.
Thank you, Eric.
He is Shad Marston, the Extension Agricultural Agent in McPherson County. That takes us into this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update with Gregg Hanzlicek. Gregg?
Jim Hershey, Executive Director of American Soybean Association's World Initiative for Soybean and Human Health, joins us. And Jim, WISH recently sent 2 poultry producers from Ghana to Kansas State for participation in the International Grains Program Institute Feed Manufacturing Short Course. What was the purpose of having them come to IGP?
Well, IGP does tremendous courses, and they get a lot of people from around the world, but we've been focusing on Ghana because there's real opportunity to grow the soybean market there, the U.S. soybean market. We got a grant from USDA's Food for Progress program to help their poultry and feed industry grow and develop and improve their techniques, and we gave part of that grant as a subcontract to KSU's feed program as well as their Reducing Post-Harvest Loss Innovation Lab. So Kansas State really gets around the world and does a lot of really good work. Some of their people went over to Ghana, did some help with the feed mills there. Carlos Campanal, he's an excellent technician. And they identified a couple people that would benefit from the course. So we found some other resources from Kansas Soybean Commission, Grant to Wish program, and we brought them over.
The main promotion is still of soy protein, but you're seeing Wish having more work in feed and also in animal agriculture.
Most of the world's soybean protein is consumed by animals around the world, and our leaders said, hey, if Wish is in Africa working on soy food, the type of food that comes out of that newly reopened plant in Hutchinson, that's good, but hey, what if somebody wants to know how to use soy in animal feed, especially poultry, and that's what got us into that part of the demand base, and then the USDA was looking for people to help them develop their feed and poultry industry. We know how to do that. The soy family has been great at that around the world over the decades, and we jumped right in.
And that really is a key to expand these markets like Ghana and others that would have the need for U.S. soy.
They already, on a spot basis, import some soybean meal from the U.S. It's hard to compete against Argentinian soybean meal, however, especially in markets like that. But we've introduced them to U.S. soybeans, and they're getting their first shipment thanks to some help from the USDA this summer. And I think they're going to find the quality difference and the availability of U.S. soybeans as being something they really want to do more of in the future.
That's Jim Hershey, Executive Director of American Soybean Association's World Initiative for Soybean and Human Health, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Gregg Akagi there. As always, Gregg, many thanks. Coming up next, our weekly K-State Horticulture segment for you. After the break, this is Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. For you now on Agriculture Today, our weekly K-State Horticulture segment, and we've horticultural disease considerations to tackle this time around. With us is a horticultural disease specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Megan Kennelly. Megan, you're really focusing in large part on lawn disease possibilities out there. You say that our weather fluctuations may have stirred up a few things in our lawns.
That's right. So here in Kansas, the weather, one day it's hot, the next day it's cold, and then it's drought, and then wet. So there's all kinds of stresses going on. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is actually not even a disease, but just the physiological stresses and some things that can make them worse. Mm-hmm. So one thing I've been seeing a fair amount lately in the plant disease diagnostic lab is a buildup of thatch in turf. Thatch is the layer of old runners and stems that builds up between the crown and the soil. Mm-hmm. So it's not the roots and it's not fallen clippings. It's like this kind of buildup of old plant material. And some of our grasses tend to build those up, like bluegrass and Bermuda grass and zoysia, things that make a lot of lateral growth. So I've had a number of samples come in lately where the turf is looking brown, looking what you might call blighted, but there's no disease. And the issue is actually there's this thick layer of thatch that has built up, and that interferes with healthy root functioning. What happens is the roots kind of hang around in the thatch and they're not down in the soil, and the plants are basically drying out. So when we hit these dry spells where it's already, hot and dry and, you feel it on you. You walk outside and it feels like the sky is just sucking the life out of you.
That's right.
That's happening to turf as well. And if it's already got this thatch problem interfering with water uptake, that turf can start to dry out pretty fast. But it's not a disease. It's just this kind of physical condition.
So the remedy is to dethatch if possible then?
Right, yeah. So you got to know first what kind of grass you have. Do you have a warm season grass or a cool season grass? So our warm season grasses would be Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, or buffalo grass. For those guys, the time to dethatch is in the summer. For the cool season grasses like fescue or bluegrass, ideally we're doing it in the fall, because when you're dethatching, you're damaging the turf, and you want to do that when it's growing well. So getting the timing right is good, and just keeping an eye on it. So, you might just take a trowel or a little shovel and dig in your lawn in a few places and just see if you're starting to get a buildup of thatch. Around a quarter inch is good, and thatch is actually what helps give turf that springy feeling when you run on it or walk on it. But if it gets to be about more than a quarter inch, you want to get on top of it. Half inch or more, definitely. And there's actually a fact sheet through our extension bookstore all about thatch. I believe it's called Thatch, a Hidden Lawn Concern, that explains in detail what to do.
So check that out. But again, noting that this is not a disease problem. It is an environmental problem that can be dealt with through the dethatching process as outlined in that publication. And you mentioned, again, warm season grasses. They did come on slowly this year because of our weather patterns once more. And that may be misleading folks into making judgments on the health of that grass too.
Yeah, so right now we're in the heat of summer, but you need to remember that we had record cold temperatures a number of times this winter, and it was slow coming out of spring. I mean, we had sleet coming down sideways in late April, and it was cold and everything was slow. So there were a number of cases earlier in the season, and even now when our warm season grasses have just taken a while to green up and get at their full summer capacity. And there were definitely lawns that had actual winter kill from those low temperatures. With Bermuda grass, for example, there's only a couple of varieties that are well suited to Kansas. And I had one case of a sample and some photos that got sent in where the Bermuda grass was looking quite bad this spring. And as it turned out, it wasn't a disease or anything. It was actually the whole lawn was a variety that was planted last year. And it's a variety that's not cold tolerant and should not be used in Kansas. What I just want to encourage people is that if you are going to be renovating a lawn or starting over, make sure you choose a variety that is adapted here. And we do have lists of those available, and you can work with your county extension agent to get a list of what those are. Because that's a big investment to plant a whole new lawn, and you don't want to go through all the work of planting something only to find out it's not hardy here.
Now, about these, what you're calling slime molds on lawns, which offer up an unsightly appearance, if nothing else, right?
Yeah, I've gotten a bunch of photos lately of, they're called slime molds, kind of this slimy, foamy yellow stuff, and eventually it dries out and gets kind of powdery. And we see that a lot of times in mulch beds as well. And they will just pop up overnight if it's humid. Again, that's changing weather leads to it. So we've got these slime molds popping up in mulch and in turf, but they're actually not plant pathogens. They're growing on top of plant surfaces or on top of the mulch, but they're just eating bacteria and organic matter and stuff. So
they're not harming the turf at all.
No. They're just sort of growing across it, and they'll often kind of disappear almost as quickly as they show up, and they're not actually getting into the turf and infecting it. They're just kind of growing on it. So it's just kind of a cosmetic thing that you don't need to worry about. Or if you just can't deal with looking at it, you can spray it with a hose just to kind of bust it up, or use a rake or something.
Yeah.
Or if you're like me, you take pictures of it and put it on your Facebook page as a conversation piece. That's what we plant pathologists tend to do.
But again, no harm to the turf itself, so
Right.
not to worry along that line.
Right.
Well, as always, the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State, Megan stands ready to help homeowners, gardeners with any mysteries of plant diseases that they might have, so they can channel those through the local extension office.
Yeah, we are here to help the agents help you, so you can work with your county agents and ship samples up to us. We're the plant doctors, and we're here to help Kansans with their plants.
And thanks for coming over.
Thank you.
Megan Kennelly, Research and Extension Horticultural Disease Specialist here at Kansas State University. So goes our Thursday edition. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.